Welcome to Million Podcasts, the show where we break down how podcasting actually works. From sponsorships and monetization to growth, audience building, and the business behind the mic. In today's episode, we're tackling one of the most common and most confusing questions in podcast advertising. How much does podcast advertising actually cost in 2026? If you've ever looked up podcast ad rates, you've probably seen a neat CPM benchmark thrown around like it applies to every show. But the reality is a lot messier than that. In 2026, podcast advertising can cost anywhere from $8 to $55 per thousand downloads. That's not a small difference, it's a huge spread. And it exists because podcast ad pricing depends on a lot more than just audience size. Genre matters, ad format matters, platform matters. Whether the ad is host-read or programmatic matters. Even the kind of audience a show attracts can move the price dramatically. So in this episode, we're going to break down podcast advertising pricing by genre, audience size, ad format, and platform. We'll talk about how CPM actually works, what counts as a billable download, which podcast categories command premium rates, how pricing has shifted from 2024 to 2026, and what variables can push your rate up or down when you're buying or selling podcast ads. We'll also walk through a sample campaign budget so you can see what these numbers look like in practice. So whether you're a podcaster trying to price sponsorships, a brand trying to plan a campaign, or just someone trying to make sense of all the conflicting CPM benchmarks online, this episode will give you a much clearer picture of what podcast advertising really costs right now. Before we get into CPM ranges by genre and audience size, we need to start with the basic pricing model behind most podcast ads, how podcast ad pricing actually works. Podcast advertising is usually priced on a CPM basis, which means cost per mille or cost per 1,000 downloads. So instead of paying a flat fee for an ad, advertisers usually pay a set rate for every 1,000 downloads an episode delivers. The basic formula is simple. Downloads per episode multiplied by CPM divided by 1,000 equals your episode cost. So if a show gets 50,000 downloads per episode and charges a $30 CPM, that works out to $1,500 for one episode. Run that across 6 episodes and the campaign cost becomes $9,000 before agency fees or any tracking tools. Now, one thing that matters here is what actually counts as a billable download. That's where IAB compliant measurement comes in. The IAB's podcast measurement guidelines filter out bots, duplicate server requests, and incomplete downloads that don't meet the required threshold. So when a publisher says their numbers are IAB certified, it means those download figures have been cleaned up using an accepted industry standard. And that matters because a show reporting 40,000 IAB certified downloads can actually be more valuable than one claiming 60,000 downloads without certification. If the numbers aren't verified, your CPM model can look cheaper than it really is. Placement also changes pricing. In general, pre-roll ads in the first minute of the episode tend to run around $15 to $30 CPM. Mid-roll ads, placed in the middle when listeners are already engaged, usually command the highest rates at around $25 to $50 CPM. Post-roll ads, placed near the end, tend to be lower, often around $10 to $20 CPM. Mid-rolls cost more because they catch the listener after they're already invested in the episode. Pre-rolls come before that commitment has built, and post-rolls only reach the smaller group who listen all the way through. Not every deal is sold on CPM, though. Smaller podcasts often use flat-rate sponsorships, where the advertiser pays one fixed amount regardless of final download count. That can make pricing simpler, but it also shifts risk. A flat-rate deal protects the podcaster if an episode overperforms, while CPM pricing protects the advertiser if it underperforms. So the big takeaway from this section is simple. Podcast ad pricing starts with CPM, but the real cost depends on verified downloads, ad placement, and the way those downloads are measured. Now that the pricing model is clear, the next question is, how much does genre actually change podcast CPM rates? Quite a lot. Advertisers don't just pay for downloads, they pay for who those listeners are and how likely they are to buy. That's why genres with concentrated buying intent or higher income audiences usually command the highest rates. In 2026, business and finance podcasts sit at the top of the market, usually around $25 to $55 CPM, because they attract decision makers, investors, and high income audiences. Technology follows closely at around $22 to $45, driven by strong SaaS and B2B demand. Health and wellness has one of the widest CPM ranges, from $18 to $40. General fitness or wellness shows tend to sit toward the lower end, while more specific medical, supplement, or health tech podcasts often command higher rates because the audience is more targeted. True crime podcasts generally fall between $20 and $35 CPM. They often attract large, highly engaged audiences, but those audiences are broader than business or technology listeners, which keeps rates below the very top tier. Brand safety review can also affect ad demand in that category. Other genres follow the same pattern. News and politics usually range from $20 to $40 CPM, education from $18 to $38, sports from $15 to $35, comedy from $15 to $30, society and culture from $15 to $28, and kids and family from $12 to $25 CPM. There's also a seasonal layer here. Quarter 4 is usually the most expensive period across almost every genre because retail, DTC, and subscription brands all increase spend at the same time. By contrast, Quarter 1 CPMs often soften, so advertisers with a flexible timing can sometimes reduce effective podcast ad costs by 10 to 20%, just by shifting campaigns into Quarter 1 or early Quarter 2. So the pattern is simple. The more concentrated the audience is around purchasing power or commercial intent, the higher the CPM tends to go. So if genre affects podcast ad pricing, the next question is, how much does audience size change what you'll pay? The answer is quite a bit, but not always in the way people expect. Smaller podcasts can sometimes charge higher CPMs than much larger shows because their audiences are more tightly defined. Bigger shows usually offer broader reach at a lower CPM, but they come with much larger minimum spends. At the micro tier, meaning shows with 1,000 to 10,000 downloads per episode, CPMs typically range from $20 to $50, with minimum buys around $200 to $500 per episode. At the mid-tier, or 10,000 to 50,000 downloads per episode, CPMs usually fall between $18 and $40, with minimum spends often landing between $500 and $2,000 per episode. For large shows in the 50,000 to 150,000 download range, CPMs often sit around $15 to $35, while minimum buys rise to roughly $2,000 to $8,000 per episode. Then come major shows with 150,000 to 500,000 downloads per episode. At that level, CPMs often drop into the $12 to $30 range, but minimum commitments jump sharply, often to $8,000 to $25,000 per episode. And at the top tier, for shows doing 500,000 plus downloads per episode, CPMs can be as low as $10 to $25, but the minimum buy can easily start at $25,000 or more for a single episode. So the overall pattern is simple. Smaller shows often charge more per thousand because they offer precision, while bigger shows charge less per thousand but require a much larger total budget. A few other patterns matter too. Micro shows usually have the most flexibility because advertisers are paying for audience concentration, not just scale. Top-tier shows often have the least CPM flexibility because they're sold through network agreements or fixed-rate packages. And across almost every size tier, multi-episode commitments tend to unlock better pricing once you commit to 4 episodes or more. One more thing. Once you get into major and top-tier podcast buys, you're often not paying for audio alone. Those packages may also include newsletter placements, social posts, or live event inventory, so if you're comparing rates, separate the value of the actual audio CPM from the value of those extra add-ons. So once you know the genre you want and the audience size you can afford, the next big question becomes, what kind of ad format are you actually buying? Because format changes pricing just as much as audience does. The first and most expensive option is host read advertising. This is where the podcast host delivers the ad in their own voice, either from a script or from approved talking points. These ads usually perform well because they feel like part of the episode rather than a separate interruption, and the brand benefits from the trust the host has already built with listeners. That's why host read mid-roll ads usually command the highest rates, often around $25 to $60 CPM. They're best for campaigns where trust, credibility, and stronger listener response matter more than sheer scale. The second option is programmatic advertising. Here, the ad is pre-produced and placed automatically into podcast inventory through an ad platform. There's no host endorsement, but it's much faster to launch and much cheaper, usually in the $8 to $20 CPM range. Programmatic works best when the goal is speed, broad reach, or lower cost awareness. Then there's dynamic ad insertion, or DAI. This is less of a creative format and more of a delivery system. It lets advertisers insert ads into episodes when they're played, including older back catalog episodes that are still getting downloads. That makes it useful for things like geo-targeting, campaign flexibility, and extending reach beyond just new episodes. CPMs here usually land somewhere around $12 to $30, depending on the show and the type of ad being inserted. So the quick takeaway here is host read is the premium option for trust and endorsement, programmatic is the lower cost option for scale, and DAI sits in the middle as a flexible way to keep campaigns running across a show's full catalog. And if you want the full format comparison table with CPMs, lead times, and best use cases, check the blog linked in the description. So once you know the format you want, the next question is, where do you actually buy podcast ads? Because platform choice affects more than just CPM. It also changes the kind of inventory you get, the minimum budget you need, and how much control you have over the shows your ads appear on. Let's start with Advertisecast. It's one of the more accessible podcast ad marketplaces and is often used as a benchmark for podcast CPMs. Rates here usually sit in the $18 to $35 range, with business and tech host read ads toward the higher end. Minimum spends often start around $500, so it's a practical option if you want curated inventory without going through a full agency setup. Then there's Acast. Acast works more like a large global marketplace with a huge catalog of podcasts and stronger category targeting. CPMs also tend to land around $18 to $35, though pricing can shift based on geography, targeting, and whether you're using self-serve or managed campaigns. Podcorn works differently. It's a creator marketplace where podcasters set their own rates directly, so pricing varies more. CPMs often range from $15 to $45, and the big advantage is flexibility. There's no minimum spend, and brands negotiate directly with hosts rather than through a network. Then there's the Spotify Audience Network. Spotify is more focused on programmatic scale and audience targeting than direct host relationships. Self-serve audio ads usually run around $15 to $25 CPM, with a relatively low minimum budget of about $250. And finally, Apple Podcasts works differently from all of the above. Apple doesn't run its own podcast ad network. It's mainly a listening platform, so if you want to advertise on a show people hear through Apple Podcasts, you're usually buying that ad directly from the show or its network, not from Apple itself. If you want the full platform comparison table with CPM ranges and minimum spends, check the blog linked in the description. So after looking at current CPMs by genre, the next question is, how much have podcast ad rates actually changed over the last few years? The short answer is not dramatically overall, but the mix has shifted. Across the market, podcast CPMs have stayed fairly stable from 2024 to 2026. What changed is where the money moved. As more podcasts adopted dynamic ad insertion, programmatic inventory expanded, which kept general programmatic pricing fairly steady, usually around $8 to $18 CPM, and now closer to $8 to $20 in 2026. But host-read ads in premium categories moved the other way. Business, finance, and technology shows all saw rates rise because advertiser demand in those categories kept growing faster than the available inventory. For example, business and finance host-read CPMs moved from roughly $22 to $48 in 2024 to around $25 to $55 in 2026. Technology rose from about $20 to $40 to $22 to $45. And health and wellness also climbed, moving from roughly $16 to $35 in 2024 to $18 to $40 in 2026. So the broad pattern is simple. Programmatic stayed relatively flat because supply expanded, while premium host-read categories kept getting more expensive because advertiser demand stayed strong. There's also a seasonal layer here. The gap between first quarter and fourth quarter pricing has widened, and on the same show with the same format, fourth quarter CPMs can now run 20 to 25% higher than first quarter rates. The practical takeaway is this. If your campaign calendar is flexible, don't just compare shows, compare timing. A 20% CPM difference on a large budget can save thousands without changing the audience, format, or targeting at all. If you want the full 2024 to 2026 CPM comparison table by genre and format, check the blog linked in the description. By this point, the big question is, what actually pushes a podcast ad rate higher or lower? A few things raise the price fast. First, timing. The fourth quarter is usually the most expensive period because more brands are competing for inventory. Second, exclusivity. If a sponsor wants to be the only brand in its category on that show, they'll usually pay a premium. Third, short booking windows. If you're trying to grab a slot at the last minute on a popular show, the rate often goes up. And finally, extra attribution tools like brand lift studies, pixel tracking, or third-party reporting can add cost on top of the media by itself. On the other side, some things bring costs down. Multi-episode commitments usually give you room to negotiate. Broader targeting can lower CPMs because the publisher has more flexibility in delivery. Back catalog placements through dynamic ad insertion are often cheaper than buying new episode inventory. And off-peak timing, especially in the first quarter, usually brings softer rates than the fourth quarter. So the simplest takeaway is this. Timing and commitment size matter a lot. If you move the same campaign from the fourth quarter to the first quarter, or commit to 4 episodes instead of 1, you can often lower your effective CPM without changing the show at all. So once you know the CPM range, the next question is, how do you actually negotiate a podcast ad rate? Most direct podcast buys are negotiable, especially with independent shows and mid-tier networks. The first step is simple. Ask for the media kit and verify the numbers. Before you build any budget around a show, confirm the audience data, download trends, and whether the download numbers are IAB certified. The second step is to anchor on volume. A single episode gives you very little leverage. But if you're committing to 4 or 6 episodes, the conversation changes. And that's usually where better pricing starts. Third, if the CPM itself won't move, negotiate added value instead. That could mean an extra placement, a newsletter mention, a social post, or category exclusivity added into the same campaign window. And fourth, open the conversation clearly. Instead of just asking, "What's your rate?" tell them what you want, for example, a mid-roll placement across 4 to 6 episodes starting in a specific month. And ask for the media kit, rate card, ad format options, exclusivity availability, and lead time. So the takeaway is simple. Verify the data, negotiate around multi-episode commitment, and if the CPM holds firm, ask for more value inside the same campaign. If you want the full outreach email template and the complete 4-step negotiation framework, check the blog linked in the description. Now, if you're not buying podcast ads directly, the next question is, what does an agency add to the cost? Because agency fees sit on top of the media buy, and that changes your real CPM. The most common model is commission on spend. In podcast advertising, that's usually around 15 to 20% of the media budget. The second model is a flat monthly retainer, which can range from around $2,000 to $10,000 or more per month. That structure usually makes more sense for ongoing managed campaigns than for small test buys. And then there's performance-based pricing, where the agency is paid based on conversions or tracked results. That does exist in some direct response campaigns, but CPM-based buying is still much more common overall. So the key thing is this: don't look only at the media budget, look at the all-in cost. If you spend $20,000 on media and your agency takes a 20% commission, your actual cost becomes $24,000. That's the number you should use when comparing agency-managed campaigns against self-serve platforms. At this point, the next question is, how do you turn all of these CPM numbers into an actual campaign budget? That's where a podcast CPM calculator becomes useful. The basic formula is simple. Take the downloads per episode, multiply by your CPM, divide by 1,000, and then multiply by the number of episodes. If you're using an agency, you add that fee on top to get the true all-in cost. For example, let's say you're buying a host read mid-roll on a business podcast that averages 25,000 downloads per episode. If the CPM is $35 and you run the campaign for 6 episodes, your media spend comes to about $5,250. Add a 15% agency fee and your total campaign cost moves to just over $6,000. That's the kind of scenario a CPM calculator helps you model before you commit. Not just the media cost, but the real budget once agency fees and campaign length are included. It also helps you compare options. If one show looks expensive at first but delivers stronger audience fit or better conversion potential, the calculator gives you a clearer way to compare it against a cheaper show with weaker targeting. Now, once the campaign actually runs, you still need to track performance. In practice, most direct podcast buys rely on 3 main methods: promo codes, dedicated landing pages or vanity URLs, and pixel-based attribution tools like Podscribe. And before you spend anything, the smartest move is to run a few target shows through the calculator first. Pull their media kits, verify whether the download numbers are IAB certified, and then compare the total projected cost before you start negotiating. So the takeaway from this section is simple. Don't evaluate podcast ad pricing in isolation. Model the full campaign first. The calculator tells you whether a rate is actually workable once you factor in episode count, agency fees, and total projected reach. If you want the interactive CPM calculator and the full sample budget template, check the blog linked in the description. Before we wrap up, let's go through a few quick questions that come up all the time around podcast advertising cost. Let's start with the biggest one. How much does podcast advertising cost in 2026? In most cases, podcast advertising falls somewhere between $8 and $55 CPM, or cost per 1,000 downloads. Where a campaign lands in that range depends on the genre, the audience, and the ad format being used. The next question is, what's the average CPM for podcast advertising? For programmatic or pre-produced ads, average CPMs are often in the high teens to low 30s. For host read mid-rolls, the range is usually higher and often $25 to $50 CPM, and even more in premium categories like business and finance. Another common question is, what's the most common pricing model in podcast advertising? It's still CPM. That's the default model across most podcast ad buys. Smaller shows may offer flat-rate sponsorships, and some direct response campaigns use performance-based pricing, but CPM is still the main benchmark. Now, what about actual budgets? How much do brands really spend on podcast ads? Smaller brands testing podcast advertising might start in the $5,000 to $15,000 range. Mid-market brands often spend more once they know the channel is working, especially if they're running across multiple shows. The next question is specifically about Spotify. How much does it cost to advertise on Spotify podcasts? Spotify audience network campaigns usually start with a relatively low minimum budget, and CPMs often sit around $15 to $25 for audio, with video inventory priced higher. And finally, which podcast genres usually command the highest CPMs? Business and finance tend to sit at the top, followed by technology and some health and wellness categories, because those audiences are more commercially valuable and often convert well for advertisers. And that's the big picture on podcast advertising, CPMs, and pricing in 2026. If you want the full CPM tables, platform comparisons, and campaign cost examples, Check the full blog linked in the description. Thanks for listening to Million Podcasts, and we'll see you in the next episode.